so just relax.
Welcome everybody to a new video, Globalization Speedrun, the EDEXCEL edition. I'm sorry you guys doing WJEC and other ones. This is very geared towards EDEXCEL. It is geared towards EDEXCEL, so click off if you're not doing that exam board. And yeah, today we're going to be doing some speedrunning of globalization. And essentially what this means is we're going to run through every single point on the spec, and this is just to help you with your exam that's probably coming up. I'm making this video in April 2024, so yeah, it's roughly a month till the first exams. So yeah, this is just designed so you get, if you're last minute cramming or whatever you're doing, the case studies need to be on lock at this point, and I'm just going to run you through everything. It might not be the most detailed explanations I'm going to give, but I feel like it's enough to get you through. So I've been asked a lot recently about how I revised, and what I did was just use the spec really. I made flashcards for every topic on the spec, or sorry, every point on the spec, and then I just slapped it on Anki, which I will show you probably later, and then I revised everything. And for this video, I would strongly advise you to have the spec in hand on a different tab or whatever, so you can read each point and then see what you need to write about it with relevant case studies. And another key point I just want to make clear, actually, is just that don't worry if you forget about case studies in the actual exam. This is just a bit of advice. The beauty of human geography is that anything goes as long as it's plausible. The thing is, there's just too many sources, and examiners, I feel like they're not up to date on most of them, because they're marking thousands of papers. They're not going to penalize you if you say something slightly off. So just an example I had from last year, in my mocks last year, I had completely forgot. My brain just went blank in the exam when asking about ICT 12 marker. I just forgot about every case study. But what I remembered was the night before, I was scrolling through my phone, and then I got a random article pop up about what's it called, K-pop. And then I was like, I had glanced, it was very useless, but when in the exam, when I couldn't think of anything else, I waffled about how ICT has created new industries, not new industries, but has accelerated industries like K-pop. And then obviously with my limited knowledge of K-pop, I just talked about BTS and how big they are. So again, guys, anything goes. So you can waffle about anything. You can even talk about, let's say, the rise of NBA and how maybe perhaps more internet leads to more people watching LeBron James clips, and hence NBA viewership goes up, so it accelerates that type of economy. But yeah, so anything goes, and also make sure you give like some statistics. And again, format of the video, I'll go through each part of the specification, and I'll give you information on each part so you don't miss anything. And yeah, just it's quite simple, this video, the format. Alright, so moving on. So the first part of the spec we look at is 3.1. Globalization is a long-standing process which has accelerated because of rapid developments in transport, communications, and business. This, looking back, this is a very boring topic in my opinion. I don't know how I survived lessons in this. But yeah, let's look at 3.1a. So A, globalization involves widening and deepening global connections. So this is just basically asking you to understand the definition of globalization. And for me, I always had these definitions on point. I never changed them, and especially for 12 markers and 20 markers, I always define key terms in the intro. So here was the definition of globalization I used. So this is the process of global integration of economies, politics, products, ideas, and other aspects of a culture. It involves the widening and deepening of connections between places. Again, look at the third bullet point. Great starter for 12 markers, asking about globalization. Anything related to globalization in a large mark question, just define globalization with this term straight away, and you should be fine. That's what it essentially means, 3.1a. Now let's go to 3.1b. Developments in transport and trade in the 19th century, railways, telegraph, steamships, accelerating. Okay, so you just need to know this case study for each of the developments. All of these are developments in transport, and you need to understand what a shrinking world is. That's the main things. And again, like the term globalization, you need to know what shrinking world means. It could be a question. You could get a question on the shrinking world. So this is literally the definition that I used every time I figured it out myself. So it's a perceptual change that places feel closer due to increased connectivity due to globalization. It's a bit of a mouthful, but this is what you need to say if you get asked about the definition. And goods and physical location are closer as new inventions like cargo ships and planes, blah blah blah. Again, good keyword need to use. And moving on from this, I will have case studies of railways, steamships, jet aircrafts, and containers. So the first case study we want to talk about is railways and how they accelerate globalization. And guys, this is like it's very logical. So your first starting point always has to be something like railways have created new transport links for migration and trade, and then this has allowed for diversification of economies. So guys, just think about it simply. If you were in England back in the, I don't know, 1000 BC, or I don't know, 1066, there would be no soy sauce or something because there's no trade routes and there's perhaps no railways transporting goods. It's just an example, or there'll be no avocados if we didn't have. Oh, sorry, that's a bad example. We wouldn't have just travel or migration as much without railways. And a big case study for this one you can use is the 1904 for Trans-Siberian Railway. And you just need to remember it connects Moscow, China, and Japan, allowing for trade and migration. And for this point, I feel like you need to say what type of globalization is accelerating. And for this stuff, it's mainly economic and social, as there's more migration and movement of goods. So yeah, that's the case study you need for this one. And then let's go back. So yeah, jet aircrafts is the next one we'll talk about. And the main case study for this you can talk about is the Intercontinental Boeing 747, which was made in the 60s. And you can just talk about how the development of these commercial planes has allowed for more international travel and more goods to be exported and stuff. And then more migration and goods, more social and economic globalization. That's a big point right there. And then another big thing you can always talk about is recently, maybe in the last perhaps 20, 30 years, don't quote me on this, you can talk about how jet aircraft has allowed for the expansion of the cheap flight sector. So EasyJet and Ryanair, that's examples. I went on a Ryanair flight to Portugal recently for like £70, so which is a bit ridiculous. In my opinion, that's very cheap. And this increases the number of people traveling and migrating. Again, more economic and social globalization. And here's the actual thing. You can just talk about stuff like foreign products are more available, like avocados in the UK, which are not native there, obviously, with the crappy weather we have. But moving on, we have the other development transfer, which is steamships and just steam power in general. And again, just talk about how Britain rose to power in 1800s due to this. And steamships and train moved armies and goods along trade routes to Asia and Africa, leading to more social and economic globalization. Again, guys, can you not see a pattern here? All these transport developments are literally accelerating economic and social globalization. And perhaps you can even mention political if you want to. If you even want to expand further within your 12 markers and I don't know 8 markers, whatnot, 4 or 12 markers, sorry. And you can talk about the Suez Canal. I should have put that in there, but yeah, moving on. And the final case study, which is my favorite because it just stuck to me, is the containerization and accelerating globalization. So containerization is literally the backbone of today's economy. That's what I love to talk about. I remember I've used this case study in my exam, I think. And you can just mention how it's one of the most efficient ways of transporting goods. And some good place-specific detail you can use are 200 million containers are shipped per year, and it has been a backbone since 1950. Not really a PSD, but you know. And what the containerization case study I used was the Chinese vessel Costco. I remember this because it sounds like Costco. And you can say it carries 13,000 containers. And then again, guys, I'm giving you the case studies, but you need to link it back to the question. And you can always say stuff like, products can be more easily sent internationally, and it has allowed companies like Amazon to increase people's exposure to new products, hence increasing social and economic globalization. So containerization is a big one. It's probably my favorite one when talking about it because I have the most detail about it. But again, guys, notice how when I'm giving you these case studies, I'm not going into too much detail. So that's a good point. So every time you have these case studies, please, using the case study doesn't give you the mark. It's what you explain with it afterwards. And what worked for me was having probably not that many. I didn't use that much case studies in my thing. I just blew up these case studies. I made it out proportion, and I really emphasized the importance of how important these case studies were. So I remember talking about this Chinese vessel Costco carrying 13,000 containers, and I was like talking about how it accelerates so many new products, and you give examples as well. Just think of it in your mind. Think of stuff like when you look at toys and products, when it says made in China, it allows new factories to form, for example, because of these containers. Companies can outsource what's it called, offshore the manufacturing plants to elsewhere and use containers to lower the cost. And you can just talk about stuff like that. And again, this is just a bare information you need. You need to expand on it. And then, yeah, so we're going to move on to 3.1c, I believe. So it's the last part of 3.1. So let's get right into it then. All right, so for 3.1c, let me just read it out. 21st century has been dominated by rapid development, ICT and global communications, phones, internet, networking, e-banking, fiber optics, lowering communication costs, and contributed to time-space compression. So, seems like a lot you need to know about, but I've condensed this into three main things you need. So that's broadband and fiber optics, the role of GIS, GPS, and the internet. And the idea is that these innovations have increased globalization rates and improved connections between places. And time-space compression, the name speaks for itself. It just makes it seem as though time and space becoming smaller because of increased connections. And we're going to talk about broadband and fiber optics first, contrary to globalizations. So what broadband and fiber optics are, they are just cables in a sense. So fiber optics are cables, high-speed communication cables. With these, large amounts of data can be moved across cyberspace and transported across ocean floors by cables owned by TNCs like B2. And then you can just waffle about how international communications are now faster, contributing to economic globalizations, and more deals are closed internationally from businesses. So I don't exactly have a case study for this, but you can just mention it. Perhaps you've seen broadband fiber optic ads on your TV. Talk about, I don't know, Virgin Media. Actually, one second. I'm gonna search up. Yeah, so if you see here, I'm sorry. I typed in the richest postcode I could think of, which is SW72TB. If it's your postcode, I apologize for that. I highly doubt it, but it's in South Kensington. And look at this, you can get fiber broadband. And just for example, if you talk about, just look at these case study, the M500 fiber broadband deal Virgin Media gives you 516 megabytes per second average download speed and 52 megabytes upload speed. Just say something like rapid internet connection will help business conferencing, stuff like that, allowing for more international communications and faster international communications. So that's an easy case study you have there. Look, this is what I'm telling you guys. Like this human geography thing, you can search up anything. If you think one of my case studies are bad, go ahead and search for one yourself. There will be one out there, and it's very simple. And yeah, you can just talk about this. Just remember to take a mental note of like the key statistics and which M500 or 250 you have. It's always 516 megabytes per second. So this is the one I recommend you use, the M500 Virgin Fiber broadband. That should be your thing. And just talk about how it can increase connections and improve internet connections. All right, so back to the slides. We can move on to GIS and GPS. So, okay, well, talk about GPS and GIS, and just talk about how the first GPS was created in the 70s. Ignore that 24, please. And this has meant deliveries can be tracked globally. Think about you guys. Like, I'm sure some of you guys have used like Temu or AliExpress. How do you think you track your shipments, or how do you think they track it? Well, they have a GPS tracker on it, probably, and then that's how they use it, and that's how they track um, shipping services like Amazon to operate and distributes goods internationally. And then, what does this mean for globalization? Well, first of all, you're increasing amount of goods being shipped across. So this is directly accelerating what's it called globalization. Sorry, which globalization? Economic globalization. And then the spread of new cultural goods. Think about the times you bought, for example, I have recently bought some coffee dripper from Japan, and I don't think that'll be able to be manufactured in the UK. And what this means is I'm culturally, I guess, culturally learning about Japanese coffee. So stuff like that. So it's also increasing social globalization in a sense. And then here is another case study. You can waffle about anything, everything, and anything. So the internet, how does the internet contribute to globalization? Guys, I know in an exam it's quite hard to think of it on the spot. So if I were you, I'll just follow my lead, and it's a bit brain dead, but just remember what the internet does in a sense. So just think simply, so increased connectivity, foreign news, videos can be shown to different cultures and different people. So increasing exposure to cultures, and this also allows for business conferencing. And I'm sure a lot of you guys still remember COVID and the lockdown, where we had to use conferencing like video conferencing like Teams and Zooms to help schools and I guess businesses to operate internationally. And the internet has also allowed culture to spread. So remember when I was talking about K-pop, I did a bit of research on it, and recently, obviously, everyone's been talking about K-pop. That's been the hype, and the international exposure of K-pop has created a massive market. And in 2019, this is the case study I used. BTS accounted for 0.3% of Korea's GDP alone. That's pretty cool in my eyes. So you can talk about how the internet has not only led to social globalization, but has paved the way for economic globalization through the spreading of culture. And we're going to move on to 3.2 now, which is political and economic decision making are important factors in acceleration of globalization. So, yeah, again, it's very simple globalization. You just need to know these like things like World Trade Organization, IMF, and the World Bank. I need to know trade blocks, and you need to know about the big case study, which you need to know a lot. Is China. China is the best case study for China and India. Probably the main case studies I used in this whole globalization section. So let's look at 3.1, 3.2a. Sorry now. So the four main organizations responsible for globalization are the World Trade Organization, IMF, and the World Bank, and all promote free trade and encourage FDI. I will expand on these case studies on the next slides. But essentially, you need to understand that the government controls a lot of globalization, in a sense. Yeah. So let's look at the role of the World Trade Organization in globalization. So the World Trade Organization, I'm going to say WTO, supervises national trade and promotes free trade, and they are all about ending protectionism, which is just protecting the country from foreign investments and keeping, I guess, their culture or the economic culture alive. And they attempt to remove trade barriers in a process called trade liberalization. And this can be seen through like easing import restrictions, easing tax restrictions on foreign companies, and stuff like that. And then you need to know the World Trade Organization. The key statistic you need to know is that apparently, I searched this up on Wikipedia when I got this. In the absence of the WTO, the average country will face an increase in tariffs on exports by 32%. So, how does this affect globalization? You're asking. Well, the WTO will obviously promote free trade, and will obviously promote more foreign businesses to set up in the country, which leads to more economic globalization. and perhaps social if the culture eventually spreads. And yeah, that is really it. Again, guys, when I told you about this video, I'm only going to give you the case studies. You guys have to connect how they link to accelerating globalization. And we're going to move on to the World Bank now. And the World Bank is slightly different. So think of, let's see, wait. So the World Bank, World Bank focuses on economic growth rather than stability. And their role is to mainly just finance development of country through loans. And the official goal is to reduce poverty by promoting foreign investment. And the key details you need to remember is that the World Bank gave its first loan to France after World War One to develop the country back again, and it focuses on natural disasters and humanitarian emergencies. And they also, key point, they give loans to both developed and developing countries under SAPs or structural adjustment programs, which I will talk about later definitely. And so, again, how does the World Bank influence globalization? Well, they encourage growth by loans and encouraging foreign international relations to be developed, like improving political globalization, I guess, and social, and again economic again. And the final one you need to know about is the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. In globalization, you've probably heard the IMF being thrown around in like videos, like not videos, movies like Wolf of Wall Street, and what's the other one? I forgot, Moneyball or something. But yeah, moving on, I'm waffling. They focus on stability rather than growth. So the difference between World Bank and IMF, one is growth, which is the World Bank, and IMF is focusing on stability. And what they do is channel loans from rich nations to poorer nations that apply for a loan. And yeah, again, governments getting loans must run a free market economy. That's an example case study you can use. So you can talk about the IMF giving loans to Bolivia, but Bolivia had to run a free market economy in the 90s. And the IMF ensures nations can return loans through SAPs, which I'll talk about later again. And another PSD you can use is South Korea after 1997 were given funding to develop its economy. And I'll move on then. And you guys might be asking, what are structural adjustment programs? Well, essentially, they're a set of rules and regulations that countries must follow in order to secure funding from the World Bank or IMF. And conditions include privatizing state controlled industries like waterworks, and reducing regulations for foreign businesses. And I think the most important thing you need to know about this is that you might get a 12 marker asking to assess the role of these international organizations in globalization. And obviously, when you assess, you need to give the positives and negatives, and you can talk about how SAPs or structural adjustment programs are bad and good. So, look at the third bullet point. When assessing the role of the IMF and World Bank, you can mention how SAPs might not be sustainable in the long term. And a classic example would be the 1986 IMF gave funding to Bolivia, but in return, the government had to increase taxation. And this led to 1998 privatization of water supplies. And you can just talk about how if this is ethically correct or just perhaps wrong, and how these SAPs can actually stunt growth in the long term and create a dependence. And yeah, as I said before, make sure to mention these SAPs in a negative light as well as positive to maximize your marks in essays. So yeah, just remember both the IMF and the World Bank use these SAPs, and they're good and bad in a sense. And here again, stressing the difference between IMF and World Bank, just saying IMF is on stability, World Bank focuses on growth, and another big difference would be the IMF works with predominantly with low income countries, but World Bank only works with both low income and high income. So IMF really focuses on channel loans from rich to poor, and World Bank focuses on just growing every economy it can see. All right, now to 3.2b. National governments are key players in promoting free trade blocks. Key players in terms of promoting free trade blocks and policies Alright, so the things to know: definition of trade blocks, very useful for essays. Two trade blocks you need to know are ASEAN and the EU, and their roles, and the policies that governments use to accelerate economic globalization. So let's talk about what trade blocks are first of all. Again, this is a definition you should note down. They are intergovernmental agreements where trade barriers to trade are reduced or eliminated among participating states, and countries can also create tariffs or exterior imports to reduce competition. And examples are EU or ASEAN. And yeah, you just need to know they they help strengthen. Wait, do I put why do? Yeah, so the reason why trade blocks form are because you need to strengthen relationships and prevent foreign trade. Not prevent foreign trade, but it's really to strengthen the economy and prevent perhaps foreign investments beating your original investments. And it just helps reduce competitions. Okay, and now one trade block you need to know is the ASEAN, which means the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And an example of what they've done, they've eliminated tariffs for free trade. And this in turn has helped like Indonesia's manufacturing industry and Philippines call centers. It's because there's been eliminated tariffs and stuff like that. There's less tax. These call centers and industries are getting taxed less, meaning more income for the country itself. And you just need to know ASEAN is expected to develop into a single market called the Asian Economic Community, and it'll be similar to the EU, where people can move freely between countries. And the classic example everyone should know about is the EU, and that's the European Union. And how do they affect globalization? Well, they members are eligible for structural funds to help develop economies. So just think about that already. That's already accelerating economic globalization. And the EU helps cities gain reputation by awarding titles like capital of culture to places and blah blah stuff like that. And the biggest thing you should talk about is the EU allows citizens of member states to move freely within the EU, encouraging migration and social globalization. Well, not so much in the UK anymore since we've left the EU, but before before 2019, people were allowed to EU students were allowed to study anywhere for free of charge. So you can say that is a benefit, and it really helps. This is talk about the migration as accelerating social globalization, and it also helps economic globalization and the free government policies that help economic globalization. So if we go back here, I'm on the second part now. So we have the three things you need to know are free market liberalization, privatization, and encouraging business startups. So how do these policies affect economic globalization? Well, free market liberalization is the idea of neoliberalism. Oh, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's the idea of just governments putting less control over businesses and leading. Sorry, this is when governments give themselves less control over businesses, and this will lead to increased economic growth as businesses can. They're just like they're not restricted to a playset of rules. And this includes examples include Thatcher's policies between 79 to 1990 in the UK, where she focused on privatization and relaxed regulations on foreign businesses. And it has been arguably successful because places like Canary Wharf into um, have developed into financial hubs with global banks like HSBC headquartering in Canary Wharf. However, you can argue the lack of regulations can be negative as this leads to lower standards and wealth is often monopolized, leading to less investments into public facilities. So again, if you get a 12 marker asking about this, you always got to think about positives and benefits. And this is literally just it. And let's move on to the next one. So how does privatization affect economic globalization? So privatization, put simply, is selling public assets to companies to save money and raise a short-term income. And yeah, so an example would be the French company Kelios owns a large stake in England's Southern Railways, and that's why you see if you ever try to get from London to Bath, it's like extortionate prices, or even London to Bristol. I remember trying to visit friends there, man. That stuff was going to cost me £60 or perhaps even £80 for a two-way trip, which is just ridiculous. You can get to a different country with that. And how does privatization influence economic globalization? So the biggest thing it does is it establishes relations between governments and TNCs, which can lead to future collaborations. So even in the UK now, a lot of energy is privatized by EDF, which is another French company, and you can just talk about how it just creates working relationships. And again, and a downside of privatization would obviously be increased prices, which is bad for the public. And again, think about how UK trains cost an arm and a leg to go to Birmingham from London. It's really stupid, but I've tried that before. I'm never going to do it again. It's just very expensive, and privatization is good in the short term, very bad in the long term. Perhaps that's what you want to argue, but it's up to you how you want to argue it. And finally, how encouraging business startups. So this is a method where it says exactly what it sounds like. It's when the government encourages people from different countries to set up new businesses. And how they do this is by enforcing low business taxes and law changes to allow foreign profit. So in Italy, there's been ease restrictions on Chinese investors wanting to start textile businesses. It really is that simple. It just encourages more businesses to start up and to base in the area, and it can lead to perhaps more tax income for the country and more economic income. All right, let's go to part C, where we're going to talk about special economic zones and China's open door policy in '78. And the things you need to know: China and SEZs, which stand for special economic zones, and how they have led to more foreign direct investment. So, what are SEZs actually? So, special economic zones are areas where governments have imposed tax incentives and large pools of cheap labor to attract foreign businesses. And again, this is a very good definition and a good starting point for questions asking about this topic. And the case study of China's open door policy is that China created 4 SEZs in southern China, and these zones had tax incentives and cheap labor, and therefore, as a result, factories began to base in these zones. And this is the key part you need to remember. By 2005, 50% of Chinese exports came from foreign companies with connections to these zones. So think about how massive China is, and think about how big of a manufacturing giant they are. Imagine 50% of exports being from foreign companies. That is pretty large, so it really shows how when China's eased restrictions on companies wanting to base in these zones, they really improved their manufacturing industries. And these zones were located in Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, Xiamen, and no need to remember all of them. Just remember one or two if you want to make the examiner giggle with excitement when they realize that you know where the SECs are located. And yeah, let's move on to 3.3. Sorry, before we go, let me see foreign direct investment. Yeah, so another small thing I missed out was that China opened. So in 1978, they didn't just create SEZs. They actually eased restrictions on foreign companies. Hence why it's called the open door policy. They let foreign investments in through these zones, and that's what you need to remember. So now we're going to talk about globalization. 3.3 has globalization has affected some places and organizations more than others. Again, it really has. It's in its name. It's quite simple, this one, so I'm gonna go on with it. All right, so 3.3. Now, let's go. Let's get to the next part. So, for 3.3a, you need to know the two main ways indices to measure globalization. So you have the COF index and the AT Kearney index. So if you look on the left, the COF index measures simply economic, social, and political globalization. And these include economic includes tariff rates, social factors, globalization measures like tourist flows, and political globalization involves stuff like membership of international organizations. And the ATCANI is slightly different. So it measures political engagement, membership, which means membership of international orgs, tech connectivity, so number of internet users, personal contact, international telephone traffic, and economic integration, stuff like FDI flows. So it's slightly different, but very similar. And perhaps they could ask you how globalization is measured, perhaps. And the second thing you need to know for 3.3b of the role of TNCs in globalization, and you need to know the definition, what TNCs do, and the idea of GPN and globalization, outsourcing versus offshoring. So quite a lot of things, but let's move on. So what is a TNC? You've learned this as GCSE, I'm assuming. Transnational corporation, companies that can operate in numerous different countries and have the capacity to work globally. So think your big companies, Adidas, what's it called? Nike, what are other big ones? Of Apple. Sorry, I'm losing my mind here. And the role of a TNC, its major role is actually just to link groups of countries together through production of goods and services. So they essentially, the role of TNC in globalization is to link countries and businesses together. And examples can you just think of large assembly industries that use parts sourced from many countries. If you think cars, computers, mention companies like Tesla or Apple, examples of big TNCs. And how do TNCs increase globalization of GPN? So a GPN is actually a global production network, and they are a chain of connected suppliers of parts and materials that contribute to manufacturing goods like Apple. And you might be wondering, how does this accelerate globalization? Well, businesses can establish relationships with governments, increasing partnerships. And you can also link this to how the Chinese government are linked with many companies due to the manufacturing boom in the 80s. And this is just like an example of how a GPN increases globalization, and partnerships and are promoted, and business relations are created. And you gotta think, another thing you need to know is globalization. So how does globalizations accelerate globalization? So what globalization is the adapting of services or products to accommodate consumers in the local market. And an example of this would be McDonald's in India do not sell pork or beef due to the large Hindu and Muslim population. So that's how they've adapted to the local consumer market. And what this does is it helps foreign cultures integrate into other societies more easily. And slowly but surely, this can help spread stuff like culture, ideology, and increase the rates of globalization, which can lead to migration, economic growth, and even just cultural globalization. So if you think about it, before India didn't have McDonald's, perhaps burgers weren't as popular. But then as McDonald's started to set up, they perhaps popularized it, and they've even adapted it so that the easing of culture spread is easier and quicker. So that is how globalization accelerates globalization. So it makes foreign things, easier for the local market to, not adhere to tolerate, and then slowly this culture spreads throughout. And you also need to know about outsourcing. So let's see, sorry. You need to know how do TNCs outsource and offshore, and how do they take advantage of it? So put simply, outsourcing, delegation of one or more business processes to an external provider who manages the selected processes, whereas offshoring is running a portion of a business operations in an entirely different country. So there's often a discourse between which is the correct one, which term it is to use. For me, I just remember offshoring as the bigger one. So offshoring is a large scale compared to outsourcing. So imagine outsourcing was moving a small part of business, whereas offshoring moves a whole division. So yeah, so just imagine offshoring is the bigger process. And the key idea you need to know here is that TNCs use offshoring outsourcing to reduce costs, which in turn establishes international relationships and accelerates globalization economically. So here's some outsourcing offshoring case studies. BT, classic case study of outsourcing, outsources its call centers, 50,000 jobs, which means to countries like India, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. And Cap Gemini, perhaps not heard of this. This is the case study I use for offshoring. They are a French company in consulting and tech, and they have offshore development centers in India and Poland to leverage the skilled workforce and low cost labor. So yeah, so TNCs use this outsourcing and offshoring to cut costs, and then this in turn creates larger profit margin, which is good for the company in the long term. And now we look at 3.3c. There are physical, political, economic, and environmental reasons why locations remain largely switched off from globalization. So, what you need to know for this one is what switched on versus switched off means. Switched on means the area is geared towards globalization and is connected well to different areas, whereas switched off is the opposite, with the area being isolated and lacking investments, hence switched off from globalization. So, essentially, it means if you're geared towards globalization or not geared. Or, yeah, that's what it means. And you just need to know the different factors leading to a place being switched off or on. Alright, so the case study for switched on places is easy. Think of any major financial capital in the world, and from there you can waffle. So I always like to use London because I'm based in London, and London is switched on to economic globalization due to its previous government policies, which gave businesses like HSBC lifelong tax breaks to encourage them to set up in Canary Wharf. This in turn increases FDI and encourages transport links like London City Airport to be made. So it's just this idea that an area can have political reasons, such as policies, and physical locations as to why it's switched on to globalization. And in the case of London, it's mainly due to its policies and perhaps location, if you think about it, since it's dead in the middle between America and the rest of Europe, which is could be a thing, could be a um, very influential factor. And I forgot to write here, but a very good thing you can talk about its physical location of London also means that when daytime trading or when businesses open in America, people in London can work with them, and when businesses open within Asia and that area region, businesses can also work with them. So London geographically is in a good time zone because they can work with both Asia and North America at the same time. And yeah, that's why perhaps London is a major financial capital. And you need to remember this is mainly due to policies and physical location. And a switched off case study would be North Korea. So Pyongyang, North Korea. I mean, how do I explain this? I'm sure you have heard facts about it from everywhere. You can use that to your advantage. So North Korea have chosen to remain economically and politically isolated. So they don't really engage in stuff like UN, I guess, and they don't really go to summits, stuff like that. And this means there's a lack of TNCs because decide to remain. They don't like to integrate their economies with other countries. Perhaps they like to integrate with China, but integrating with one economy isn't exactly the play if you want to expand very quickly. And another thing is citizens have no access to the internet or social media, so culture is not spread. So think about your favorite thing in life. It could be Taylor Swift, Kanye West, or One Direction. Or I don't know, perhaps Beethoven. And let me think of another one. Denzel Curry. Imagine you had no internet. You would have never discovered any of these guys. Now think about North Korea. They're not allowed internet. So that means there's no culture spreading. And so if culture is not spread, then there's a lack of social globalization, and it's quite hard for a country's ideologies to seep into another. So what I mean by this is you hear a lot of Taylor Swift songs being about breakup stories. It's really started a movement of, I don't know, breakup music, I guess, or heartbreak music. And Kanye West started perhaps 808s, some stuff like that. it would have never spread to North Korea, so we would never know, and citizens wouldn't know. And so culture's not spread, so there's a lack of social globalization, switching them off. And there's no underseas data cables connected to North Korea, and this is a lack of communications. And this is an interesting one. So you know how I mentioned how you need to know the reasons why a place is switched on or off. So I mentioned so far in economic for North Korea, one of their policies, sorry, because they remain to remain politically isolated. A big policy is the Song gun policy, which I probably butchered, and North Korea have a military first approach, which means that spending mostly goes to the military, and this leads to a lack of spending for subsidies and connections for the local people, and this leads to even less connections between North Korea and the world. Now, another switched off place you probably need to know, just in case, is the Sahel region. So this Sahel region is a area in Africa with countries near Chad, Mali, and places area around there. And this area is mainly switched off due to a physical location. So they don't actually have a coastline in the region. So there's a lack of global trade of goods. Remember what I talked about containerization? The containerization requires boats and massive cargo ships. And if you don't have a coastline, you can't really travel anywhere and sell your goods, can you? And another thing would be its physical climate. So it's got arid conditions, which means it suffers from desertification, which makes it very hard for infrastructure to implement. And this, in turn, makes it less attractive for investors because they can't really get their products or services to the area and out quickly. So they don't see it as a viable market. And this, in turn, switches it off from investment and switches it off from economic globalization. And its low average wages perhaps is more of just a social factor. Just poverty in the region does really mean that it's a low spending power. So brands don't see Sahel region as a viable market, and it switches them off from consumer markets. Like it's an area where you wouldn't see Adidas or perhaps your KFC, your creams, your American candy shops that would set up everywhere in London, and your I don't know, Four Seasons hotels. It really, these companies wouldn't put them there because no one could afford it in the first place, and it would just be a waste of money. So this is why they're switched off economically. So yeah, so I talked about this is more of a physical location problem, whereas North Korea is more political. And the switched on place for London and New York, they're probably switched on due to policies and a mixture of location. So yeah, let's move on to 3.4. So the global shift has created winners and losers for people and the physical environment. So for this one, this is a very interesting one. I personally like this section because it's pretty cool to learn about it. You don't really dupe it when you actually know the lesson, but globalization is still boring. So this is the best of a bad bunch. And you need to know the definition and idea of global shift with its pros and cons, socially, economically, and environmentally in the developing versus developed world. So let's move on. So before we start, we look at 3.4a. You need to define global shift. So the definition of global shift is, again, it's the relocating of the global economic processes to Asia from Europe and North America, and this includes manufacturing work and other sectors. So it literally just means the shifting of an industry towards another region. And as a result of this has actually led to benefits and problems for both of the developing and developed worlds. And you need to know the main ones are China and India, and you need to know about, and probably just UK and America. So you might be how the next section will be processed is that I'm gonna give the impacts of a global shift for both developing and developed world. So let's look at the social impacts of developing world of the global shift on the developing world. So the global shift has actually meant that education has improved in Asia, and a good statistic you can have now is that 2,500 unis are now in South Korea, India, and China today, it's because of this increased investment from the manufacturing work. Asia was able to invest back into their education systems. And I don't know if you've watched these videos, but like the China, they have the hardest exam in the world. So they really have a prestigious education, the Gaokao, where it's like 13 hours just of pure writing. And in South Korea, they have the entrance exams, and in India, they have that GAET thing. And yeah, so that's perhaps a more positive impact, social impact. But at the same time, the global shift has also increased the growth of slums. So you'll see this particularly in Dharavi and Mumbai, where the informal economy has grown. And as a result, there's been like a large rural to urban migration and an influx of migrants. And this leads to urban growth, but oftentimes this has led to uncontrolled urban growth when shanty towns and slums are beginning to develop. And when you can escalate this further, say how these slums have no proper sanitation and water and waste services, so they often lead to poor health, which you could probably find statistics on. And there's just a lack of housing as well due to rapid urbanization, meaning areas like Mumbai, Chongqing, perhaps have a high level of homelessness. And yeah, have also led to, again, link it to the growth of slums. Now, the social impacts of global shift on the developed world, are usually regarded as negative, but a big one obviously is today is reduced cost of goods. I didn't put this in here, but this is very self-explanatory. The positive impacts on like developed world is cheaper cost of goods, and also just mainly cheaper costs, and really perhaps environmentally it's better since there's less of fumes and factories running about. But the main thing you need to know is that since the 70s, European and American factories have closed due to the manufacturing shift to Asia, and this has caused a loss of jobs in the Rust Belt region, and this includes like Michigan, Baltimore, those areas. And what this has led to is actually increased crime rate and decreased life quality, more vandalism, more perhaps low income families developing. So, moving on, environmental impacts of the global shift on the developing world. So, since 1990, Togo has actually lost 60% of its forested area, and 40% of China's groundwater is now polluted. Again, guys, I've given you just the bare bones of the information. You guys need to actually expand upon this. So, you can say stuff like more deforested area means less carbon dioxide is being pulled out of the air. You need some more breathing problems in Togo. Or now China's groundwater has led to water scarcity. It's an economic problem as they can't afford to. It's very expensive for desalination plants, and they've had to invest in new things, new water pumps, and they can't tap into the resource anymore. So simple stuff like this. Now, environmental impacts of global shift on the developed world. So I don't really have anything for this. I had a massive hole in my notes for this. I felt as though I don't really know what's right for this one, to be honest, because when I researched it, nothing was really clear if it was due to the global shift or not. But if you have something, just think about it, drop it down in the comments if you want to help someone else. I have a massive hole in my notes, as I said before, so I just gave you a few pictures just for fun, have a look at them, take a breather, and then at the end of the video. And the economic impacts of the global shift. I haven't split this between developing and developed world, but for the developing world, which this could include the new Asian target countries like Hong Kong and South Korea, 1 billion people have actually been lifted out of extreme poverty, and this is defined as people earning less than $1.25 per day. So I guess that's a positive. And by 2030, Asia will be home to 3 billion middle class people. So that's a massive one. And I guess the biggest economic impact on the developed world is that there's been a massive loss of jobs, mainly US car manufacturing, British textile firms, British shipbuilding has taken a massive hit due to the global shift. You could just name any industry that you think of has died in a country, and it's probably due to the global shift, to be honest with you. And I think I'm going to stop here for part one. I'll see you in the next one. Again, this is a very whistle stop quick tour. I'll see you guys in the next one.